The wind did not merely blow across the Wyoming basin on that Christmas Eve. It hunted. It screamed down from the Bighorn Mountains, gathering ice and malice, scouring the plains until the world was nothing but a blinding, suffocating sheet of white. The temperature had dropped so low that the air itself felt brittle, ready to snap, and the darkness was absolute save for the pale, ghostly luminosity of the driving snow. Clara O'Rourke moved through this frozen hell like a ghost herself. She could no longer feel her feet. Her boots, cheap leather worn thin by years of hard use, had soaked through hours ago, and now her toes were heavy, dead weights that she dragged forward only by the sheer, stubborn refusal to lie down and die. She wore a coat that did not belong to her. It was a rough, woolen thing, smelling of old tobacco and horse grease, stolen from a peg in the livery stable as she had fled the town of Red Hollow. It was 3 sizes too big, hanging off her slender frame, but beneath it, the absurdity of her attire was a cruel joke. Under the heavy, reeking wool, she was wearing a wedding dress. It was white silk, or what passed for it in the general store, trimmed with cheap lace that scratched her skin. Now, the hem was heavy with ice and mud, dragging in the snow, tearing against the sagebrush hidden beneath the drifts. Every step was a battle against the dress, against the wind, against the memory of the morning that had driven her out into this killing storm. She stumbled, her knee hitting the hard-packed earth beneath the snow, and a cry was torn from her throat, instantly swallowed by the gale. She stayed on her knees for a moment, gasping, the icy air burning her lungs. It would be easy to stop here. The thought was seductive, warm, and sweet. Just to curl up, just to close her eyes. No. The voice in her head sounded like the boarding house matron, Mrs. Gable, sharp, unforgiving. But beneath that, there was a newer fear, the fear of Henry Kincaid. Clara forced herself up, swaying. She had to keep moving. If she stopped, she froze. If she went back, she was finished. As she trudged forward, head bent against the biting sleet, the memories of the day assaulted her, fragmented and sharp as broken glass. She saw the interior of the church in Red Hollow. It had been decorated with pine boughs for Christmas, the scent of sap warring with the smell of beeswax candles and the suffocating odor of too many bodies packed into the pews. They had all been there, the whole town, not to celebrate a union, but to witness a transaction. She saw Silas Kincaid, the father, a man who looked like he was carved from granite and ledger paper. He stood by the altar, his silver pocket watch chain gleaming in the candlelight. He owned the bank, the dry goods store, the livery, and, by extension, most of the souls in Red Hollow, including hers, $75. That was the sum, that was the price of her life. Her mother had died owing it to Mrs. Gable for room and board, and Mrs. Gable had sold the debt to Silas Kincaid, and Silas had decided that his son, Henry, needed a wife to settle him down, a wife who could not say no, a wife who was already owned. Clara remembered the grip of Mrs. Gable's hand on her arm in the vestry, pinching the tender flesh. You smile, Clara, you smile and you say your vows, or you will rot in a debtor's cell. Henry's a good catch for a gutter rat like you. Henry Kincaid. Clara shuddered, and it wasn't from the cold. She remembered his face, flushed with whiskey even at 10 in the morning. He was handsome in a soft, spoiled way, with a mouth that always looked wet. He had cornered her 2 days before the wedding, backing her against the wall of the mercantile, his hand pressing flat against her stomach, claiming his property before the deed was signed. You are going to be good for me, Clara, he had whispered, his breath smelling of cloves and spirits. I like things that I have to break a little. She had stood at the back of the church, the organ wheezing out a hymn. The doors were closed. The sheriff stood near them, arms crossed, nodding to Silas. There was no way out. But then, the distraction. A drunk miner had stumbled in the side door, knocking over a candelabra. The flame had caught on a dried pine wreath. A shout. A moment of confusion as men rushed to stomp out the sparks. In that split second of chaos, Clara had not thought. She had moved. She had turned and bolted through the vestry door, out into the alley where the snow was just beginning to fall. She had run until her lungs burned, grabbing the coat from the stable hook as she passed. And she had not stopped running until the town was a smudge of gray smoke behind her. Now, that smoke was a miles gone. Red Hollow was 10 miles south, maybe more. She was alone in the emptiness. The wind gusted, nearly knocking her flat again. She squinted through the stinging ice crystals. There, a shape. It was a hard, angular shadow against the white gloom. A roofline, a chimney, and, miracle of miracles, a faint, flickering orange glow. A window. It was a ranch house, isolated, alone. She did not know who lived there. It could be a place of thieves. It could be a house full of men who would see a helpless woman as a Christmas gift. But her body made the choice for her. Her legs turned toward the light. She reached the fence line, the wire humming in the wind. She crawled through, snagging the coat, snagging the dress. She stumbled across the yard, past the looming bulk of a barn that smelled faintly of hay and manure, a smell that promised life. She reached the porch. The wood was slick with ice. She dragged herself up the steps, her hands like blocks of wood. She fell against the door, her fist pounding on the rough timber. "Help!" she croaked, but the wind tore the word away. She hit the door again. "Please!" Inside the cabin, the silence was heavy, broken only by the hiss of the fire and the rhythmic ticking of a clock on the mantel. Elias Ward sat in a high-backed leather chair, a book open on his knee, though he had not turned a page in an hour. The room was shadowed, lit only by the fireplace and a single kerosene lamp on the table. It was a clean room, sparse and orderly. A rifle hung above the door. A calendar from the bank in Cheyenne hung on the wall. There were no ornaments, no holly, no Christmas tree. Elias was a man built for this country. He was tall, with shoulders broadened by years of lifting beams and wrestling calves. His face was a map of the territory, hard plains, deep lines around his eyes, and a weathering that made him look older than his 40 years. A thin, white scar ran from his left temple into his hairline, a souvenir from a horse that hadn't wanted to be broken. He heard the thump against his door. He froze, his head tilting. The wind played tricks out here. It could sound like a woman screaming, or a child crying, or a man dying. But that sound, that dull, rhythmic thud, was solid. He set the book down. He stood up, his movements fluid and quiet. He crossed the room and took the Winchester from the wall, levering around into the chamber with a metallic clack that sounded loud in the quiet room. He did not like visitors. He especially did not like visitors on Christmas Eve in a blizzard. Visitors meant trouble. They meant someone was lost, or someone was hunting. He reached the door and lifted the heavy iron latch. The wind pushed against it, trying to force its way in. Elias shoved back, opening the door just enough to look out. The snow swirled in, biting at his face. He looked down. He blinked, sure that the isolation was finally making him see things. There was a woman on his porch. She was a heap of wet wool and snow, slumped against the doorframe. But where the coat had fallen open, he saw the gleam of white satin. She looked up at him. Her face was gray, the lips cracked and bleeding, her skin waxy with hypothermia. Her eyes were wide, dark, and terrified, but there was a spark in them, a desperate, feral defiance. "Help me," she whispered. The sound was like dry leaves scraping together. Elias stared. A bride, a half-dead bride on his porch in the middle of the worst storm in 5 years. His instinct was to close the door, not out of cruelty, but out of a deep, ingrained wariness. He wanted no part of whatever drama had spun this woman out of the void. He wanted his silence. He wanted his peace. But then he looked past her, into the white swirling dark. A memory hit him with the force of a physical blow. A night 10 years ago, a different blizzard. His younger brother, Thomas, riding out to check the herd and never coming back. Elias remembered the waiting. He remembered opening this same door 100 times that night, screaming Thomas's name into the wind, hearing only the howl in return. He remembered finding Thomas 3 days later, curled up against a fence post, frozen solid, not 500 yards from the house. If he closed this door, she would be dead in an hour. Elias let out a sharp breath through his nose. He shifted the rifle to his left hand and reached out with his right. Grabbing the woman by the arm, she flinched violently, crying out, but he hauled her over the threshold, kicking the door shut behind her and dropping the latch. The silence of the cabin returned, sudden and ringing, but now the air was charged with the intruder's presence. Clara collapsed onto the floorboards. The heat of the room hit her like a wall. It was too much. Her skin began to burn as the blood tried to rush back to the surface. She gasped, clawing at the collar of the heavy coat. "Easy," a deep voice rumbled above her. She looked up. The man was a giant. In the firelight, he looked terrifying, a dark beard, eyes that were in shadow, a scar vanishing into his hair, and a gun in his hand. She scrambled backward, sliding on the wood, until her back hit the wall. "Do not shoot me," she stammered, her teeth chattering so hard the words were barely intelligible. "I have no money. I have nothing." Elias frowned, looking down at her. He leaned the rifle against the wall, a deliberate gesture to show he was not going to kill her. At least, not yet. "I am not going to shoot you," he said. His voice was rusty, unused. "Get up. You are freezing." He moved toward her, and she flinched again, raising her hands to protect her face. In the firelight, Elias saw the wrists. They were thin, pale, and circled with dark, purple bruises shaped like fingerprints. His eyes narrowed. He stopped. "I am not going to touch you," he said, softer this time. "But you cannot sit on the floor. You will catch your death." Clara watched him, her chest heaving. He did not look like the men in town. He did not look like Henry. He looked hard, like the land itself. But he had put the gun down. She nodded. Once, sharp and jerky. She tried to stand, but her legs were water. She stumbled. Elias moved fast. He caught her by the elbow, his grip firm but impersonal, and guided her to the wooden chair by the hearth. He grabbed a rough woolen blanket from the back of the settee and threw it over her shoulders. "Stay," he commanded. He went to the stove. There was a pot of coffee sitting on the warmer. He poured a tin cup full, the steam rising in a gray plume. He brought it to her. "Drink," he said. "It is black. It will help." Clara took the cup with both hands. Her fingers were shaking so badly the hot liquid sloshed over the rim, scalding her thumbs. But she didn't care. She brought it to her lips and gulped. The bitterness was shocking, but the heat was life. She drank it down, feeling it burn a path to her stomach. Elias watched her from the other side of the fireplace. He stood with his arms crossed, leaning against the mantel. He took in the details. The boots were ruined. The coat was a man's, stolen likely. And the dress. "You ran from a wedding," he stated. It wasn't a question. Clara lowered the cup. The warmth was making her dizzy. "Yes, whose?" She looked at the fire, refusing to meet his eyes. "Does it matter?" "It matters if a groom and a wedding party are tracking you to my door," Elias said. Clara let out a short, harsh laugh that turned into a cough. "They are not tracking anything tonight. Not in this. The storm will break," Elias said. "Men will ride." "Let them ride," Clara whispered. She looked at him then, her eyes hard. "I will not go back. I will freeze in your yard before I go back." Elias studied her. She was small, thin as a rail, looking like a strong gust would snap her in two. But the set of her jaw was iron. He knew that look. He saw it in the mirror every morning. "Who are you running from?" he asked again. Clara hesitated. She gripped the tin cup tighter. If she told him, would he throw her out? If he knew who she belonged to? Everyone in the territory knew Silas Kincaid. Everyone feared him, or owed him. "Someone powerful," she said carefully. "Someone who thinks he can buy people like cattle." Elias's face remained impassive, but a muscle feathered in his jaw. He looked at her wrists again, at the bruises darkening in the firelight. "Men who own banks and stores," Elias said quietly. usually think they own the law, too, especially in towns like Red Hollow? Clara looked up sharply. You know Red Hollow? I know it, Elias said. He turned away, picking up the poker to jab at the logs in the grate. Sparks flew up the chimney. I know the type of men who live there. Then you know why I ran, Clara said. I can guess, Elias muttered. He placed another log on the fire. The silence stretched between them again, but it was less hostile now. It was the silence of two people assessing a threat. Outside. The wind slammed against the cabin walls, rattling the shutters on their hinges. The sound was a roar, a physical weight pressing down on the roof. Clara shivered violently. I cannot leave tonight. Elias looked at the window, black with night and snow. No, you cannot. You would be dead in a mile. I can work, Clara said quickly, desperation creeping back into her voice. She tried to sit up straighter, shedding the blanket slightly to show she was capable, though she was still trembling. I can cook. I can mend clothes. I can clean. I do not want charity. I just need until the storm breaks. Elias looked at her. He saw the terror she was trying to hide. He saw the exhaustion pulling at her face. He let out a sigh, a sound of resignation. He was a fool. He knew he was a fool. Keeping her here was dangerous. If she belonged to a powerful man, hiding her was theft. It was a crime. It would bring the law, and with the law, the prying eyes he had spent 10 years avoiding. But he looked at the empty chair where his brother used to sit. You will take the bed in the back room, Elias said gruffly. The sheets are clean. I will sleep out here by the fire. Clara let out a breath she felt she had been holding since she ran from the church. Thank you. I can pay you back. Somehow. We will talk about debts in the morning, Elias said. Right now, you look like you are going to fall over. He pointed to a door on the far side of the room. There is a pitcher of water. Wash the mud off. I will find you a shirt. You cannot sleep in a wet dress. He moved to a heavy wooden chest at the foot of his sleeping cot and rummaged through it. He pulled out a flannel work shirt, gray and worn soft. He tossed it to her. Clara caught it. Thank you. Go, Elias said, turning his back to her to give her privacy. And sleep. The storm is going to get worse before it gets better. Clara retreated into the small back room. It was freezing in there, the air still and stale. She stripped off the heavy coat, letting it fall to the floor. Then, with shaking fingers, she undid the buttons of the wedding dress. She stepped out of the silken lace, leaving it in a puddle of white on the floorboards. She hated it. She wanted to burn it. She washed her face and hands with the icy water from the pitcher, hissing at the sting. She pulled on Elias's shirt. It engulfed her, hanging down to her knees, the sleeves swallowing her hands. It smelled of wood smoke and sage and him. It smelled of safety. She climbed into the narrow bed, pulling the heavy quilts up to her chin. She thought she would lie awake all night, terrified that the door would burst open and Henry would be there. But the exhaustion was a tide she could not fight. Her eyes closed. In the main room, Elias added another log to the fire. He laid his bedroll out on the rug. He checked the Winchester again, setting it within arm's reach. He lay down, staring up at the rough-hewn beams of the ceiling. Why had he let her in? He knew better. He was a man who lived by calculation, by careful, silent moves. He owned half the town of Red Hollow, and nobody knew it. He held the deeds to the saloon, the livery, the boarding house. He held the notes on the farms in the valley. He kept his power hidden, buried under shell companies and lawyers in Cheyenne, because he had learned long ago that being known was dangerous. And now, he had a fugitive in his back room, a woman running from the very people he held financial dominance over. He listened to the wind. It sounded like a woman screaming his name. Elias, Elias. He closed his eyes, willing sleep to come. Hours later, the sound of a cry woke him. It was not the wind. Elias was awake instantly, his hand closing around the stock of the rifle before his eyes were fully open. He sat up. The sound came from the back room, a whimpering, panicked sound. He stood and crossed the floor on silent feet. He pushed the door open. Clara was thrashing in the bed, tangled in the quilts, in the pale moonlight filtering through the frost-covered window. Her face was a mask of terror. "No!" she moaned, tossing her head. "Please, I don't belong to you!" She threw an arm out, striking the air, fighting off an invisible attacker. "Let me go, please!" Elias stood in the doorway, feeling a strange tightness in his chest. She was dreaming of the wedding, of the man she had run from. He should wake her. He should shake her shoulder and tell her to be quiet, but he didn't. He walked to the side of the bed. He crouched down, placing the rifle on the floor. "Clara," he said softly. She gasped, her eyes flying open. She didn't see him. She stared blindly at the ceiling, her chest heaving, tears streaming down her temples into her hair. "They are coming," she whispered. "They are coming to take me." "No," Elias said. His voice was low, a rumble in the dark. "No one is coming. The storm has buried the road. No one can get through." Clara turned her head, her eyes finding his silhouette in the darkness. She blinked, pulling reality back into focus. The cabin, the rancher, the escape. I am sorry," she stammered, wiping at her face with the sleeve of the oversized shirt. "I had a nightmare. I'm sorry I woke you." "It is all right," Elias said. He felt an urge to reach out, to brush a strand of damp hair away from her forehead. The impulse shocked him. He pulled his hand back, resting it on his knee. "You are safe here tonight," Elias said. He felt the need to make her believe it. "I have a lock on the door and a rifle by my side. No one enters this house unless I say so. You do not belong to anyone tonight but yourself." Clara looked at him. In the shadows, the scar on his face was invisible. He was just a warm, solid presence against the dark. "Thank you," she whispered. "Go back to sleep," Elias said, standing up. He felt too large for the room, too close to her vulnerability. Morning comes early. He picked up his rifle and retreated to the main room, pulling the door almost closed, leaving just a crack of light. He lay back down on his bedroll, but sleep was gone. He listened to the wind howling outside, battering the walls, trying to get in. But for the first time in years, the emptiness of the ranch didn't feel quite so vast, and that, Elias realized with a sinking feeling in his gut, was the most dangerous thing of all. The storm raged on, burying the world in white, sealing them in together as the clock ticked toward Christmas morning. The morning broke with a silence so profound it felt heavy, a physical weight pressing down on the roof of the cabin. When Elias opened the door, the world had been erased. The gray fury of the night before was gone, replaced by a blinding, brutal clarity. The sky was a hard, polished blue, stretching endless and indifferent over a landscape sculpted from white marble. The drifts were high, curving up against the side of the barn like frozen waves, and the fence posts were mere nubs of gray wood poking through the snow. The cold was sharper than it had been during the storm. It was a still, biting freeze that instantly crystallized the moisture in the nose and made the lungs ache with every inhale. Elias stood on the porch, his breath pluming before him like dragon smoke. He looked toward the road, or where the road used to be. It was gone. The track to Red Hollow was buried under 3 feet of snow, deeper in the hollows. No wagon could pass. A horse might struggle through, but it would be a punishing ride, risking a broken leg for the animal. They were trapped. He turned back inside, the latch clicking shut with a sound like a pistol shot in the quiet air. Clara was already awake. She sat on the edge of the cot in the back room, still wearing his flannel shirt, her hair a tangled copper halo around her pale face. She looked small, swallowed by the room, swallowed by the situation. But when she saw him, she stood up. "I'm going to help," she said. Elias frowned, moving to the stove to stir up the embers. "You are going to sit. You nearly froze to death 10 hours ago." "I'm fine," Clara said, though her voice shook slightly. "I told you I would earn my keep. I do not take charity. Mr. Ward, it is not charity to keep a guest from dying." Elias grumbled, adding wood to the fire. "And there is nothing out there for you but frostbite. The drifts are waist-high." Clara tightened the sash she had improvised from a strip of cloth around her waist. "Then I will shovel, or I will feed the animals. You have livestock. They need eating." Elias looked at her. She was trembling, not just from cold, but from a nervous, frantic energy. He recognized it. It was the need to be useful, the terrifying belief that if she was not working, she had no right to exist. He had seen it in unbroken horses that flinched before the whip was even raised. "Suit yourself," he said shortly. "There are old trousers in the chest, and a pair of boots that might fit if you wear 2 pairs of socks. Do not complain to me when your fingers go numb." 10 minutes later, Clara was struggling across the yard, her feet vanishing into the snow with every step. She wore a pair of canvas trousers that were rolled up 3 times at the ankle and a heavy coat that smelled of hay. She carried 2 metal buckets, intending to haul water from the pump to the chicken coop. The wind had died down, but the air was a knife. It sliced through the layers of wool, finding every gap. Clara bit her lip, forcing herself forward. Her hands, wrapped in oversized leather gloves, fumbled with the pump handle. It was frozen stiff. Elias watched her from the door of the barn. He had a pitchfork in his hand, intending to toss hay for the horses, but he paused. He watched her throw her entire small weight against the iron handle. Once, twice. On the 3rd try, it groaned and gave way, water splashing out, instantly slushy in the bucket. She was clumsy with exhaustion, her movements jerky, but she did not stop. She filled the buckets, then lifted them. The weight pulled her shoulders down, her spine curving under the strain. She took a step, stumbled, corrected herself, and kept going. Elias felt a prick of irritation, not at her, but at the situation, at the world that had made a girl like this feel she had to break her back to justify breathing his air. He watched the line of her neck as she bent her head against the cold, a pale curve of skin exposed above the collar of the coat. He looked away, annoyed with himself. He didn't want to notice the curve of her neck. He didn't want to notice her grit. He wanted to be alone. He strode out into the yard, the snow crunching loudly under his boots. He reached her in 4 long strides and took the buckets from her hands without a word. "I can do it," Clara protested, reaching for them. "Get the eggs," Elias commanded, his voice rough. "The hens are likely frozen to the roosts. Go!" He walked away before she could argue, carrying the heavy buckets as if they were filled with feathers. Clara stood there for a moment, blinking against the glare of the sun on the snow, then turned and trudged toward the coop, her jaw set in a hard line. Breakfast was a quiet affair. The cabin smelled of frying bacon and strong coffee, a scent that made Clara's stomach cramp with sudden, violent hunger. She hadn't realized until she sat down at the rough-hewn pine table just how empty she was. Elias pushed a plate toward her, bacon, biscuits, and eggs. It was more food than she had seen on her own plate in a month. She ate quickly, with a focus that spoke of missed meals. Elias ate slowly, watching her over the rim of his coffee mug. "You said you ran from a wedding," Elias said, breaking the silence. "You did not say how you ended up in it." Clara paused, a biscuit halfway to her mouth. She lowered it slowly. The food sat heavy in her stomach now. "I was sold," she said flatly. Elias's dark brows pulled together. "Slavery is illegal, Miss O'Rourke, even in this territory." "There are papers that say otherwise," Clara said. She looked at her hands. "My mother died when I was 12. We lived in Mrs. Gable's boarding house on the edge of town. My mother was a seamstress, but she got sick. The doctor, the medicine, the rent, the debts piled up." She took a breath. "Mrs. Gable kept a ledger, every bowl of soup, every piece of coal for the stove. When my mother died, Mrs. Gable said the debt was mine now. I worked for 6 years in that house, scrubbing floors, washing sheets, cooking for the miners. But the debt never went down. She added interest. She added fees for breakage if I dropped a plate." Elias listened, his face impassive. but his hand tightened around his mug until his knuckles turned white. He knew Mrs. Gable, a sour-faced woman with a heart like a dried prune. "Last week," Clara continued, her voice dropping to a whisper, "Silas Kincaid came to the house. He and Mrs. Gable drank tea in the parlor. When he left, Mrs. Gable told me that Mr. Kincaid had purchased my debt. He paid her off, all of it, $300. "And the price?" Elias asked. "Henry," Clara said. The name tasted like ash in her mouth. Silas said Henry needed a wife to settle him down, someone who wouldn't argue, someone who knew her place. If I married Henry, the debt would be forgiven. If I didn't, she looked up at Elias, her eyes wide and haunted. Silas said he would have me thrown in the county jail for theft and fraud. He said he owns the judge. Elias set his mug down. The sound was a sharp crack against the wood. "He does," Elias said. The anger in his voice was cold, contained, like deep water under ice. "Silas Kincaid owns the judge. He owns the sheriff. And he thinks he owns this valley." Clara shuddered. "Henry, he came to see me. He touched my face." She raised a hand to her cheek, rubbing it as if to scrub away a stain. "He laughed. He said I was a cheap investment. He said he would make sure I earned every penny his father spent." Elias looked at her. He saw the terror etched into her features, the deep, abiding fear of a trapped animal. He felt a surge of rage so pure it nearly choked him. He knew the Kincaids. He knew their methods. They didn't just want money. They wanted dominion. They wanted to see people crawl. He stood up abruptly, startling Clara. He walked to the window and stared out at the white emptiness. What Clara didn't know, what nobody in Red Hollow knew, was that Elias Ward was the one who actually held the paper on Mrs. Gable's boarding house. He had bought the mortgage 3 years ago through a lawyer in Denver, intending to keep the interest rates fair, to stop the woman from being evicted by the bank. He had thought he was doing a good thing, but Mrs. Gable had taken his leniency and used it to exploit a child. She had sold a human being to cover a debt that Elias himself would have forgiven if he had known. The irony was bitter. He had tried to use his wealth to protect people from exactly this kind of cruelty, hiding behind anonymity to avoid the fawning and the begging. And instead, his silence had allowed the Kincaids to step in and shatter a life. "They are rotted wood," Elias muttered to the glass. "All of them." Clara watched him. She sensed something shifted in the room. This was not the reaction of a simple cattleman. Most men would have laughed or told her that a debt was a debt, but Elias stood with the tension of a soldier. Her eyes drifted around the room. She had been too exhausted to notice the night before, but now, in the daylight, she saw things. The furniture was heavy oak, well made, not the rough pine scraps most homesteaders used. The rug by the fire was a thick, patterned wool, possibly Navajo, and on the desk in the corner, there was a ledger. It was bound in black leather with gold lettering on the spine. It looked like the book Silas Kincaid carried. She stood up and carried her plate to the basin. As she passed the desk, she glanced at the open book, rows of neat figures, names, dates, amounts that made her head swim. $2,000, $500. Elias turned from the window. He saw her looking. He crossed the room in 3 long strides and snapped the book shut. Clara jumped back. "I am sorry. I did not mean to pry." "Curiosity," Elias said, his voice tight, "is a dangerous habit in the West. Miss O'Rourke. It is just—" Clara hesitated, her curiosity pricking against his wall of silence. "You have a lot of numbers for a man with only 50 head of cattle." "I have other interests," Elias said, sliding the ledger into a drawer and locking it. "And my business is my own." The rebuke was sharp, but Clara didn't shrink away. She looked at him, measuring him. "You are not like them," she said. "The men in town. You talk different. You live different." "I live alone," Elias said. "That is the only difference that matters." By the afternoon, the sky remained clear, and Elias decided they needed to check the road. If the Kincaids were coming, he needed to know if the pass was open, and they were low on flour, if they were going to be snowed in for a month. They needed supplies. He saddled 2 horses, the big bay gelding for himself, and a smaller, steady mare for Clara. She mounted with a surprising grace, despite her lack of proper riding clothes. She sat the horse well. "Stay behind me," Elias ordered. "Let the bay break the trail." They rode out of the yard, the horses plunging chest-deep into the drifts. It was slow, grueling work. The sun beat down on the snow, creating a glare that forced them to squint until their eyes watered. The only sound was the huffing of the horses and the squeak of leather. They made it a mile down the track, to where the land rose into a ridge that overlooked the valley leading toward Red Hollow. Elias held up a hand. "Wait." He pulled a brass telescope from his saddlebag and extended it, training it on the distant ribbon of white that was the main road. Clara watched him, shivering in her coat. "What do you see?" "Nothing," Elias said. "Snow, drifts 10 feet high in the cut." He panned the glass to the left, scanning the ridgeline. Then he froze. "What is it?" Clara whispered, sensing his tension. "Riders," Elias said softly. 3 of them, on the crest." He handed the glass to her. Clara took it, her gloved hands clumsy. She pressed her eye to the lens. At first, she saw only blur. Then, she focused. 3 figures on horseback, silhouetted against the blue sky. They were miles away, tiny specks, but the telescope brought them terrifyingly close. The man in the lead wore a long buffalo hide coat with a distinct, light-colored collar. He sat his horse with a slouch, a bottle passing from his hand to the man beside him. Clara gasped, nearly dropping the glass. "Henry!" She knew that coat. He had worn it the day he cornered her in the mercantile. "Are you sure?" Elias asked, taking the telescope back. "It is him," Clara said, her voice rising in panic. "He is looking for me. He knows I came this way. He doesn't know anything," Elias said calmly, though his eyes were hard. "He is guessing. He is looking for tracks, but the wind covered your trail last night. He will see us," Clara said, wheeling her horse around, the animal dancing nervously in the deep snow. "We have to go back. We have to hide." Elias looked at the riders. They were stationary, scanning the valley. If Elias and Clara kept moving forward, they would be spotted against the white snow. The dark shapes of the horses would be visible for miles. He looked at Clara. She was pale as the snow, her eyes wide with terror. The sight of Henry Kincaid, even miles away, had reduced her to trembling. Elias felt that protective flare again, hotter this time. He wanted to ride down there and drag Henry Kincaid off his horse, but that was a fool's game. "We go back," Elias said. "Quietly, keep to the tree line." They turned the horses and picked their way back toward the ranch, keeping the bulk of the ridge between them and the watchers. They rode in silence, but the air between them had changed. The threat was no longer abstract. It was 3 men on a hill, waiting for a mistake. The days that followed fell into a routine that was both monotonous and tense. The weather held, cold, hard, and unrelenting. The snow did not melt. It formed a crust of ice that crunched loudly underfoot. Clara worked. She refused to sit idle. She took over the cooking, making stews from dried beef and potatoes, baking biscuits that were surprisingly light given the limited supplies. She scrubbed the floors until the wood shone. She mended Elias's shirts, her needle flashing in the firelight. Elias spent his days outdoors, tending the cattle, chopping wood, endless amounts of wood to keep the stove hungry. But slowly, the walls between them began to thin. It happened in small moments. One morning, Clara was scattering grain for the chickens. She was humming a tune, something lilting and Irish. A particularly bold hen pecked at the toe of her boot, then fluttered up to peck at the grain sack in her hand. Clara let out a startled laugh, a bright, clear sound that cut through the cold air. Elias, sharpening an axe by the barn, looked up. He hadn't heard laughter on this ranch in 5 years. It sounded foreign. It sounded good. He watched her shoo the hen away, her face flushed with the cold and amusement. She looked younger. She looked less like a victim and more like a woman. Another afternoon, Elias was splitting logs. Clara came out to gather kindling. She watched him swing the axe, the easy, rhythmic power of it. "I want to try," she said. Elias paused, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the freezing temperature. "It is heavy." "I am strong," she said. He handed her the axe. She took it, the weight immediately pulling her arms down. She swung it at a log. The blade bounced off the wood with a dull thunk, vibrating up her arms. "You are holding it wrong," Elias said. He stepped behind her. He didn't think about it. He reached around her, his large hands covering hers on the handle. "Slide your top hand down as you swing," he murmured. He was close, too close. His chest was inches from her back. Clara could feel the heat radiating from him. She could smell the scent of pine pitch and honest sweat. She froze. Elias froze. For a heartbeat. Neither of them moved. His hands were rough, warm, engulfing hers. The contact was electric, a sudden current that made Clara's breath hitch. Elias stepped back abruptly, clearing his throat. "Like that, slide the hand." He walked away to check the fence line, leaving Clara standing by the wood pile, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The attraction grew like the drifts outside, silent, accumulating, impossible to ignore. It was in the way their fingers brushed when she handed him a mug of coffee. It was in the way he lingered in the doorway in the evenings, watching her braid her hair by the firelight, the copper strands glowing like spun gold. It was in the way she noticed his eyes softening when she spoke, the harsh lines of his face smoothing out. But they did not speak of it. The shadow of the Kincaids, and the shadow of their own pasts, lay too heavy between them. Then came the night the thermometer broke. The temperature plummeted to 30 below zero. The wind returned, a low, moaning beast that circled the house. The frost was so thick on the inside of the windows it looked like lace curtains. Elias piled wood into the stove until the iron belly glowed cherry red, but the heat died 3 feet from the hearth. "It is too cold in the back room," Elias said, staring at the fire. "The draft in there will freeze water in the pitcher tonight." Clara sat in the chair, wrapped in a quilt. She nodded. "I can see my breath in there." Elias hesitated. He looked at the floor rug in front of the hearth. It was the only warm place in the house. "Bring your bedding out here," he said, keeping his voice practical. "We will sleep by the fire. It is the only sensible thing to do." Clara looked at him, searching for any sign of impropriety. She saw only concern. "All right," she said. They arranged their blankets on opposite sides of the hearth, a respectful 5 feet of braided rug between them. Elias blew out the lamp. The room was plunged into darkness, save for the red-orange glow of the embers through the stove grate. They lay in the quiet, listening to the house groan as the timbers contracted in the cold. "Elias?" Clara's voice was a whisper in the dark. "Yes? Why do you live alone? You are a good man. You have land. Why is there no one else?" Elias lay on his back, his hands behind his head. He stared up at the invisible ceiling. He had not spoken of this to anyone, not in 10 years. "I wasn't always alone," he said. His voice was rough, scraping over old wounds. "There was a woman. Her name was Sarah." Clara turned on her side, watching his silhouette. "We were to be married in the spring." Elias continued. "I was young, ambitious. I wanted to build the herd up. I went on a cattle drive to Montana. It was supposed to take 3 weeks. It took 6. He paused. The wind howled outside. A blizzard hit while I was gone. Not like this one. Worse, Sarah. She was at her father's place, but she tried to ride to town to get the doctor for her sister. She got lost." Clara felt a dull ache in her chest. "Oh, Elias." "I came back 2 days later," Elias said. "They had just found her. If I had been here, if I hadn't been so hungry for money, for more cattle, I would have been here. I could have stopped her. Or I could have found her." "You could not have known," Clara said softly. "I should have been here," Elias said. The guilt was as fresh as the day he buried her. "I decided then I would not bring anyone else into this life. I would not be responsible for another loss. It is easier to be alone. You cannot fail someone who isn't there." The silence stretched, heavy with his pain. "I have never been wanted," Clara said. The confession slipped out before she could stop it. Elias turned his head toward her. "What do you mean?" "My mother loved me," Clara said, "but she was always tired, and after she died, I was just a pair of hands, a back to carry loads, a mouth to feed." Her voice trembled. "Mrs. Gable didn't see me. She saw a servant, and Silas saw a debt to be collected. Henry saw a toy to be broken." She pulled the blanket tighter around her chin. "No one has ever looked at me and just seen Clara. I have always been something to be used or sold." Elias looked at her across the divide of the rug. In the dim red light, he could see the sheen of tears in her eyes. He felt a fierce, terrifying desire to cross that space, to wrap his arms around her and tell her that he saw her, that he saw the fire in her, the courage, the gentleness. But he didn't move. He couldn't. He was a man defined by his failure to protect the woman he loved. And she was a woman defined by her fear of being owned. To touch her now would be to confirm her fears. "You are not a debt," Elias said, his voice low and intense. "And you are not a toy. You are Clara O'Rourke, and you survived the storm. That is what matters." Clara closed her eyes, a single tear tracking hot across her temple. His words were a balm, but they were also a torment, because for the first time in her life, she wanted to be wanted. Not for her labor, not for her debt, but for herself. And she was terrified that if she reached out for it, she would find only another cage. "Good night, Elias," she whispered. "Good night, Clara," he replied. They lay in the red dark, separated by 5 feet of rug and a lifetime of scars, listening to the winter wind try to tear the world apart. January deepened, settling over the valley with a weight that felt permanent. The snow did not melt, it merely compacted, turning into a hard, white shell that encased the ranch in silence. But inside the cabin, the air had changed. The sparse, masculine austerity of Elias Ward's life was slowly being eroded by the presence of Clara O'Rourke. It started with the curtains. Clara had found a bolt of yellow calico in the bottom of the old sea chest at the foot of the bed, fabric Elias had bought years ago, intending to make shirts but never finding the time. She cut it with his shears, her hands moving with the practiced dexterity of her mother's trade, and sewed them by the light of the fire. When she hung them, the room suddenly held the morning light differently, trapping a warmth that had been missing for a decade. Then came the mending. Elias was used to wearing his shirts until the collars frayed to threads and the elbows blew out, at which point he would relegate them to rag duty. Now, he would wake to find his flannel shirts folded on the chair, the tiers stitched shut with tiny, invisible rows of thread. But it was the sound that changed the most. Clara hummed. She did it without thinking, a habit from the long, lonely hours in the boarding house kitchen. She hummed Irish hymns her mother had sung, low and mournful tunes about rocky coasts and leaving home, and sometimes brighter carols that lingered past the Christmas season. The melody would drift through the cabin while she kneaded dough or swept the hearth, winding its way into the timber walls. Elias, sitting in his chair with his ledger or a book, would stop reading. He would listen to the soft, vibrating sound of her voice, feeling a strange tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with the cold. He found himself watching her when she wasn't looking, studying the way the firelight caught the stray hairs escaping her braid, or the way her brow furrowed when she was concentrating on a difficult knot. He began to invent reasons to take her outside. "The horses need exercise," he said one morning, the sky a brilliant, blinding azure. "The bay is getting restless. He needs to run, and the mare needs work." Clara looked up from the socks she was darning. "Is the snow not too deep?" "The wind has scoured the ridge clear," Elias said, lying only slightly. "It will be good for you to see the land. You have seen nothing but 4 walls and a snowbank for a month." So they rode. They wrapped themselves in layers of wool and buffalo hide until they could barely move, and they rode out into the glittering expanse of the Wyoming winter. Elias showed her the boundaries of his world. He took her to the high ridge where the black pines stood like sentinels against the white sky, their branches heavy with snow. He pointed out the valley floor, buried now, but where the grass grew waist-high in June. That is where the herd summers, he said, his voice muffled by his scarf. The water comes down from the peaks and floods the lower pasture. It is the best grazing land in the county. Clara watched him as he spoke. She saw the way his eyes scanned the horizon, possessive and proud. He loved this land. It was the one thing he allowed himself to love without reservation. It is beautiful, she said, her breath clouding in the air. Terrifying, but beautiful. The land does not care if you are afraid, Elias said. It only cares if you are respectful. They rode down toward the creek. In the summer, Elias told her. It was a slow, lazy ribbon of brown water. Now, it was a jagged scar of ice cutting through the willows. We have to cross here, Elias said, reining in the bay. The bridge is out. The ice is thick enough to hold a wagon, but walk the mare slowly. They dismounted to lead the horses across, fearing a slip would break a leg. Elias went first, his boots crunching on the uneven surface. The wind whistled through the bare willow branches, a dry, rattling sound. Clara followed, leading the mare. She was halfway across when her boot found a patch of smooth, wind-polished ice hidden beneath a dusting of snow. Her feet went out from under her. She gave a sharp cry, flailing for balance. The mare jerked back, snatching the reins from her hand. Clara hit the ice hard, sliding toward the edge where the current ran fast and black beneath a thin crust. Clara! Elias moved with a speed that belied his size. He dropped his reins and lunged, his boots skidding. Just as Clara's legs began to slide over the lip of the ice, he caught her. He grabbed her by the waist, his arm hooking around her midsection like an iron band. He hauled her back, spinning her around and pulling her hard against his chest to arrest her momentum. They stood there, freezing in the center of the frozen creek, clutching each other. Clara's hands were gripped tight on the lapels of his sheepskin coat. Elias's arms were wrapped around her, holding her off the ground, her boots dangling inches from the ice. For a moment, there was only the sound of their ragged breathing and the thudding of their hearts. Clara looked up. Elias was looking down. His face was inches from hers. She could see the flecks of gray in his dark beard, the dilation of his pupils, the raw, unguarded panic that was slowly fading into something else. Heat, despite the biting wind, despite the ice beneath them. A sudden, searing heat flared between them. It was not just relief. It was the sudden awareness of his body against hers, the solid wall of his chest, the strength of his thighs, the protective, overwhelming power of his hold. Elias stared at her. He felt her trembling against him, small and fragile, yet alive. He smelled the scent of the lavender soap she used, sharp and clean in the cold air. He wanted to kiss her. The thought struck him with the force of a physical blow. He wanted to crush her mouth to his and breathe the warmth back into her. The moment stretched, taut as a bowstring. Then the mare whinnied from the bank, breaking the spell. Elias blinked. He slowly lowered Clara to her feet, though he did not immediately let go of her waist. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rougher than usual. "No," Clara whispered. She couldn't find her full voice. I am fine." "Watch your step," Elias said. He released her, stepping back, putting a safe distance between them. "The ice is treacherous." They finished the crossing in silence, the air around them vibrating with the words they hadn't said. That night, the wind picked up again, tapping snow against the window pane with a soft, persistent rhythm. They sat by the fire, Elias cleaning his rifle, Clara mending a tear in her skirt. The silence was different now. It wasn't the comfortable silence of two people coexisting. It was heavy, charged with the memory of his arms around her. "Elias," Clara said softly, not looking up from her needlework. "Yes, thank you." He paused in his wiping of the barrel. "For what?" "For catching me today," she said. She looked up then, meeting his eyes across the firelight. "That is twice now you have saved my life." Elias looked at her. He saw the sincerity in her face, and something deeper, a tentative trust that terrified him. "You walked 10 miles in a blizzard in a silk dress," Elias said quietly. "You saved yourself. Clara, I just opened the door. Clara flushed, a pink tint rising in her cheeks. Perhaps, but you let me stay. I would have been a monster not to, he muttered, returning to his rifle. But his hands were clumsy now. The image of her face, inches from his on the ice, would not leave him. 2 days later, the outside world intruded. A lone rider appeared on the road, a ranch hand named Jeb, who worked for the Double T spread 20 miles north. He was riding a shaggy pony and leading a pack mule, trying to beat the next storm to the trading post. Seeing smoke from Elias's chimney, he turned in for coffee. Elias met him on the porch, rifle in hand, but relaxed when he recognized the old man. He invited him in, though he felt a spike of anxiety. Clara was in the back room, but she couldn't hide forever. Jeb stomped the snow off his boots and accepted a mug of coffee with a grateful groan. He was a gossip, starving for conversation after a month alone in a line shack. Town is in an uproar, Elias, Jeb said, warming his hands around the mug. You hear about the Kincaid boy? Elias leaned against the counter, his face impassive. I do not hear much out here. Jeb, what about him? His bride ran off. Jeb cackled. Left him at the altar on Christmas Eve. Vanished into the storm like a phantom. Kincaids are tearing the county apart looking for her. Silas is offering a $500 reward. In the back room, Clara pressed her hand over her mouth, her heart hammering against her ribs. Is that so? Elias said evenly. That ain't the half of it, Jeb continued, lowering his voice conspiratorially. Sheriff Miller is asking questions about you. Elias. Elias went still. Me? Why? Silas Kincaid has been digging into the county records, Jeb said. Seems he found out who really bought the note on the Gable boarding house. And the livery, people are saying you've been buying up half the town right under their noses. They are saying you are a snake in the grass, Elias, and... Jeb paused, looking around the cabin. Some are saying maybe you are the one hiding the girl, since she ran this direction. People say a lot of things when they are bored and cold, Elias said, his voice dropping an octave. If Silas Kincaid has a question for me, he can ride out here and ask it himself. Jeb laughed nervously. I reckon he might. Once the drifts melt, just thought you should know. Folks are riled up. When Jeb left an hour later, the cabin felt smaller. The safety they had built felt fragile, like thin ice. Clara came out of the back room. She looked pale, her eyes dark with guilt. They know, she whispered. They suspect. Elias corrected. There is a difference. It is the same thing to men like Silas, Clara said. She walked to the window, staring out at the white prison of the yard. I have dragged this to your door. They will come for you. Elias, they will burn this place down to get to me. Let them come, Elias said, his jaw setting. No. Clara turned to him. I cannot let you lose everything because of me. You have worked your whole life for this ranch, for your peace. Clara, I have to go, she said, her voice rising with panic. I have to leave, tonight. If I go now, maybe they will follow my tracks away from here. Do not be foolish, Elias snapped. Where will you go? Cheyenne? It is 100 miles. I do not care, Clara cried. I will not stay here and be the reason they destroy you. She ran to the hooks by the door and grabbed the heavy coat. She began shoving her arms into the sleeves, her movements frantic, tear-blinded. Elias watched her. He saw the terror driving her, but he also saw the love. She was willing to walk back out into the death of winter to save him. Clara, stop! She ignored him. Reaching for the latch, Elias crossed the room and slammed his hand against the door, holding it shut. I said stop! Let me go, she sobbed, fighting him, her hands beating ineffectually against his chest. You do not understand. They destroy everything they touch. I will not let them touch you. They cannot touch me, Elias roared, grabbing her shoulders and shaking her once. Hard. Look at me, Clara gasped, looking up at him. She was crying freely now, tears tracking hot paths through the dust on her face. I am not afraid of Silas Kincaid, Elias said, his voice fierce. And I am not afraid of the town. but I am afraid of you walking out that door and dying in the snow." "I am nothing to you," Clara yelled, the words tearing out of her throat. "I am just a stray you took in. You do not owe me this." "You are not a stray," Elias shouted back. The silence of the house was shattered. "You are the only thing in this house that is alive. Do you understand that? Before you walked in here, I was a ghost in my own home." The words hung in the air, vibrating. Clara stared at him, her chest heaving. "Elias." He let go of her shoulders, stepping back, running a hand through his hair. He looked agitated, pacing the small space of the floor. "You cannot leave," he said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "But you cannot stay as you are. The town talks. They call you a whore. They say I am keeping you." "I know," Clara whispered. Elias stopped pacing. He turned to face her. The firelight cast long shadows across his face, highlighting the scar, the deep-set eyes. He looked terrifying and desperate. "Marry me," he said. Clara stopped breathing. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. "What?" "Marry me," Elias repeated. "If you are my wife, you are not a runaway. You are not a debt to be collected. You are Mrs. Elias Ward. The law recognizes that Silas Kincaid cannot touch a man's wife. He would have to go through me, legally and physically." Clara backed away until she hit the table. "Marry you? To pay a debt? To hide?" "For protection," Elias said. "It is the only way to stop them." "No," Clara said, shaking her head. The word brought back the suffocating scent of the church, the grip of Henry's hand. "No, I will not be bought again. I will not be owned." "I am not trying to buy you." Elias stepped forward, his hands clenched at his sides. "It is the same thing," Clara cried, her fear turning to anger. "You want to marry me to fix a problem, like mending a fence. You want to put your name on me so the Kincaids know I belong to you now, not them. I am not a cow. Elias, I am not a parcel of land." "I do not want to own you," Elias yelled. "I want to keep you." "Why?" Clara demanded. "To cook your meals, to warm your bed, to spite Silas Kincaid." "Because I cannot stand the thought of you leaving." Elias's confession cracked through the room like a whip. He stood there, breathing hard, looking as if he had been struck. He hadn't meant to say it. He hadn't meant to open that door. Clara stared at him. The anger drained out of her, leaving her trembling. "What?" Elias looked at the floor, then at the fire, then finally, agonizingly, at her. "I am not good with words." "Clara," he said, his voice low and gritty. "I have spent 10 years not speaking to a soul more than I had to, but you woke me up. You argue with me. You sing. You work until your hands bleed because you are too proud to ask for help." He took a step toward her. "I do not want a housekeeper. I do not want a trophy to wave in Silas Kincaid's face. I want you, here, with me." Clara watched him, her heart pounding a rhythm against her ribs that hurt. She saw the vulnerability in his eyes, the fear of rejection that matched her own fear of entrapment. "I am afraid," she whispered. "I am afraid that if I marry you, I will disappear, that I will just be Elias's wife, that I will lose myself again." "You could never disappear," Elias said softly. "You are too loud." A small, watery laugh escaped Clara's lips. Elias reached out, slowly, giving her time to pull away. He took her hand. His palm was rough, calloused, warm. "I am not asking to own you, Clara," he said, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "I am asking to stand beside you. If you marry me, and the day comes that you want to leave, if you want to walk away, I will not stop you. I will give you a horse and money and let you go. I promise you that." Clara looked at their joined hands. She looked at the man who had pulled her from the snow, who had caught her on the ice, who had offered her shelter without asking for anything in return. She realized then that she didn't want to leave. The thought of the open road, of a life without his quiet presence, without the smell of his wood smoke and coffee, felt colder than the blizzard. "I do not want to leave," she said softly. Elias went still. "Then stay, as your wife, as my partner," Elias said, as my equal. Clara looked up into his face. She saw the scars, the harshness, but she also saw the man beneath them, the man who had grieved for a decade, who protected what was his, who treated the land with respect. Yes, she whispered. Elias let out a breath, a long, shuddering exhale. He pulled her toward him, not violently this time, but with a desperate gravitation. Clara, he breathed. He lowered his head. Clara rose on her toes to meet him. The kiss was not like the one Henry had stolen in the alley. It was not wet or possessive. It was slow. It was searching. Elias's lips were dry and warm, pressing against hers with a tentative pressure that asked a question. Clara answered. She opened her mouth slightly, her hands coming up to grip his shirt. The kiss deepened, breaking the dam. The desire that had been simmering under the surface for weeks flooded through them. Elias groaned low in his throat, his arms wrapping around her, pulling her flush against him. Clara felt the strength of him, the heat, and for the first time in her life, she didn't feel trapped. She felt anchored. They broke apart, breathless, foreheads resting against each other. "We will do it," Elias said, his voice unsteady. "We will do it soon." The wedding took place 3 days later. A circuit-riding preacher, a man named Reverend Cole, who traveled on snowshoes, made his way to the ranch on his way to the mining camps. Elias hailed him from the porch. They were married in the main room of the cabin, with the fire crackling and the smell of pine in the air. Their neighbor, a stoic Swede named Anderson, who lived 5 miles east, stood as the witness, holding his hat in his hands. Clara wore the gray wool dress she had been wearing when she arrived, but she had mended it and pinned a sprig of dried sage to the collar. She had scrubbed her face until it shone. Elias wore his Sunday suit, black and severe, but his eyes were bright. When they said the vows, Clara's voice did not shake. She promised to love and to cherish. She did not promise to obey. And the Reverend, seeing the look in Elias's eye, did not ask her to. "I pronounce you man and wife," the Reverend said. That night, the cabin was quieter than it had ever been. The Reverend had moved on. Anderson had ridden home. The world outside was black and cold, but inside, the fire cast a golden glow over everything. Elias locked the door. He turned to look at Clara. She was standing by the table, her hands twisting nervously in her skirt. He walked over to her. He did not touch her immediately. "You are shaking," he said gently. "I am nervous." Clara admitted. I do not know what to do. I have never—" "Neither have I." Elias lied. Or perhaps it wasn't a lie. He had never been with a wife. He had never been with someone he loved this much. Not like this. He reached out and unpinned the sage from her collar, setting it on the table. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, he began to undo the buttons of her dress. Clara held her breath. She waited for the fear to come. She waited for the feeling of being a debt paid, but it didn't come. Elias's hands were reverent. He touched her skin as if she were made of glass, or something even more precious. When the dress fell away, he looked at her in her chemise, his eyes dark with a hunger that made her knees weak, but he waited. "Clara?" he asked. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Elias." She reached for him then, her hands fumbling with his shirt. They came together in the bed in the back room, under the heavy quilts. It was awkward at first, a tangle of limbs and nervous laughter. But then the instinct took over. The need to be close, to erase the space between them, became consuming. When Elias kissed her neck, Clara arched into him, a sound escaping her throat that surprised them both. When she ran her hands over the scars on his back, Elias shuddered, burying his face in her hair. There was pain, briefly, and the memory of old traumas, but they navigated it together. He was gentle where Henry would have been rough. He was slow where the world had been fast. And when they finally lay still, tangled together in the aftermath, Clara rested her head on his chest, listening to the steady, strong beat of his heart. She realized, with a profound sense of wonder, that she was not owned. She was held, and for the first time in her life, She was home. February arrived not with a promise of spring, but with a stubborn, lingering grayness. The sun had begun to linger longer on the horizon, bleeding watery light over the snow-packed valley. But the nights remained fiercely cold. The drifts had receded into slumps of dirty ice, and the ground was beginning to reveal itself as a vast expanse of half-frozen mud. But the air still carried teeth. Inside the cabin, however, the climate had shifted entirely. Clara and Elias Ward were learning the geography of their marriage. It was a territory as unfamiliar to both of them as the high passes of the Rockies. They moved around each other with a growing ease, shedding the politeness of strangers for the comfortable, silent rhythms of a shared life. Elias learned that Clara hummed when she was anxious. It was a low, vibrating sound, usually a minor key, that started in her throat when she looked out the window at the road or when the supplies in the pantry grew low. He learned that she needed to be busy to feel safe. If her hands were idle, they would twist in her apron, seeking a ghost of the work that had defined her existence for so years. Clara, in turn, learned the language of Elias's silence. She learned that when he paced by the north window, his hands clasped behind his back, he was worrying about the spring calf or the price of feed. She learned that when he sat by the fire in the evening, staring into the flames with a furrowed brow, he was not angry but merely thinking, turning over thoughts like stones in a riverbed. And she learned his body. The bed in the back room, once a symbol of his charity and her desperation, had become their sanctuary. The intimacy between them had deepened rapidly, fueled by the isolation and the profound relief of finding safety in another human being. There were nights of eager, almost desperate passion, where they clung to each other as if the world outside were ending, their movements urgent and hungry. But there were also nights of quiet discovery, where Elias would trace the line of her spine with a rough, calloused hand, marveling at the softness of her skin, or where Clara would press a kiss to the scar on his temple, whispering against the white line that marked his past pain. It was during one of these quiet evenings, while the wind rattled the loose shingles on the roof, that Elias opened the heavy oak drawer of his desk and took out the black ledger. He placed it on the table between them. The oil lamp cast a warm, yellow circle of light on the leather cover. "I want you to see this," Elias said. His voice was steady, but Clara saw the slight tension in his shoulders. "If we are partners, you need to know what we hold." Clara reached out and opened the book. The pages were filled with Elias's neat, angular handwriting, rows of dates, names, and sums of money. She ran her finger down the first page. She recognized the names: Miller, Henderson, O'Malley. "These are the homesteads in the lower valley," Clara said, looking up. "I hold the notes," Elias said. "When the bank in Cheyenne threatened to foreclose 2 years ago after the drought, I bought the debts. I lowered the interest to 3%. Clara turned the page. Her breath hitched. The Red Hollow Mercantile, the livery stable, the Drover's Rest Saloon, and there, halfway down the page, written in black ink, Gable Boarding House. Clara stared at the entry. "You own Mrs. Gable's house?" "I own the mortgage," Elias corrected gently. "I bought it 5 years ago. She pays me, not the bank." Clara sat back, her mind reeling. The house where she had scrubbed floors until her knees bled. The house where she had been sold like a piece of furniture. Elias had held the paper on it the entire time. "Does she know?" Clara asked. "No," Elias said. "She pays a solicitor in Laramie. He sends the money to an account in Denver. She thinks a syndicate owns it." "Why?" Clara asked. "Why do you do this? Why do you own half the town and let them believe you are just a rancher?" Elias stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the darkness. "After Thomas died, and Sarah, I was angry. I was angry at the randomness of it, the lack of control. I had money from the herd, and I had inherited a small sum from an uncle back east. I thought if I could control the land, I could create stability. I thought if I held the debts, I could stop the bank from throwing good families into the snow when the winter was hard." He turned back to her, his face shadowed. "I wanted to be fair. I wanted to be the safety net that I never had, but I found out quickly that people do not want a savior they can see. They resent the man who holds their debt, even if he is kind. If I walked into town and told them I owned their roofs, they would not thank me. They would hate me for having what they do not. So you let them think you are a vulture, Clara said softly. You let them whisper that you are hoarding land. It was easier, Elias admitted. Let the rumors pile up like snowdrifts. I did not have to look at them if I stayed out here. I thought I could keep the world at arm's length. Clara looked at the ledger again. She saw the power in it, but she also saw the loneliness. He had built a kingdom of paper to try and force the world to make sense, to try and prevent tragedy by controlling the ground everyone stood on. You are a good man, Elias, she said, closing the book. Better than they deserve. I am just a man, Elias said, coming back to the table and resting his hand on her shoulder. A man who got tired of losing things. But while Elias and Clara built their fortress of understanding, the world outside was gathering its forces. In Red Hollow, the humiliation of the Kincaid family had not faded with the winter. It had festered. Henry Kincaid sat in the back of the saloon, drinking whiskey that cost more than a miner made in a week. His face perpetually flushed with a sullen, dangerous heat. He had been jilted. A girl with nothing, a girl he had bought, had run from him. And worse, she had run to the scarred, silent hermit on the ridge. His pride was a raw, open wound. Every time he walked down the boardwalk, he imagined he heard laughter. He imagined the town was mocking him for being less of a man than Elias Ward. Silas Kincaid, however, was not a man ruled by emotion. He was ruled by leverage. He sat in his office at the back of the Mercantile, smoking a cigar, and looked at the situation with cold, reptilian eyes. The marriage was an insult, yes, but it was also an opportunity. For years, Silas had sensed a blockage in his expansion. Properties he wanted to buy were snatched up by anonymous buyers. Loans he wanted to predatory lend on were suddenly refinanced by unknown parties. He had suspected Elias Ward had money, but he hadn't realized the extent of the threat. Now, the enemy had revealed himself. By marrying the girl, Elias had made himself vulnerable. We do not just want the girl back, Henry, Silas told his son one afternoon, watching the smoke curl from his cigar. The girl is nothing. She is a symbol. But Ward is the dam holding back the river. If we break him, we get everything. We get the land. We get the water rights. And we get the respect back. I want to kill him, Henry muttered, spinning a knife on the desk. No, Silas said sharply. Martyrs are expensive. We do not kill him. We ruin him. We turn the town against him so thoroughly that when we strip him of his land, the people will cheer. And so the rumors began. They started in the saloon, whispered by men on the Kincaid payroll. They drifted into the sewing circles and the church vestibule. Did you hear? The O'Rourke girl didn't run because she was scared. She ran because she smelled gold. I heard she seduced Ward, worked her way into his bed on Christmas Eve. That is why he married her. She trapped him. And Ward, they say he is going to call in all the loans. They say he married the girl and now he needs cash to keep her in silk. He is going to throw the widow Miller out. He is going to foreclose on the livery. The lies were crafted with precision. They fed on the town's existing prejudices, their suspicion of Elias's silence, and their disdain for Clara's poverty. It was a narrative that made sense to them. The wicked, grasping woman and the ruthless, miserly land baron. By the time the first true thaw of spring arrived, turning the road to Red Hollow into a slurry of mud and slush, the atmosphere in the town was poisonous. Clara felt the change before she even saw a soul. They needed supplies, flour, sugar, coffee, and seed for the spring planting. Elias had tried to go alone, but Clara had insisted on coming. I am your wife, she had said, tying her bonnet strings with shaking fingers. I will not hide in this cabin like a fugitive. If I hide, it makes the lies true. Elias had looked at her, seeing the fear in her eyes but the steel in her spine. He had nodded, saddling the horses. The ride into town was tense. As they turned onto Main Street, the activity seemed to freeze. A woman at the water pump stopped cranking, her hand resting on the iron handle, watching them pass with narrow, judgmental eyes. She leaned over to whisper to her neighbor, neither of them bothering to lower their voices. Two men sitting on the porch of the saloon stopped talking. One of them spat a stream of tobacco juice into the mud as Clara rode by. Clara held her head high, staring straight ahead between the horse's ears. She could feel the hostility like a physical heat on her skin. She felt dirty, though her dress was clean. She felt branded. They tied the horses in front of the general store. Elias helped her down, his hand lingering on her waist for a second longer than necessary. A silent claim. "Stay close," he murmured. They walked into the store. The bell above the door jingled cheerfully, a stark contrast to the sudden silence that fell over the room. There were 3 other customers in the store, and Silas Kincaid's clerk behind the counter. And there, leaning against a stack of feed sacks near the back, was Henry Kincaid. He looked older, somehow. His face was puffy, his eyes red-rimmed. He was wearing a fine suit that looked out of place in the dust of the store. When he saw Clara, a slow, cruel smile spread across his face. "Well, well," Henry said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent room. "If it isn't the happy couple." Elias stiffened, stepping slightly in front of Clara. "We are just here for supplies. Henry?" Henry pushed himself off the sacks and walked toward them. He stopped 5 feet away, ignoring Elias entirely and fixing his gaze on Clara. He looked her up and down, his eyes lingering on her bodice in a way that made her skin crawl. "Hello, Mrs. Ward," Henry said, dragging out the name with mocking emphasis. "I must say, marriage suits you, better fed than you were. Certainly, I suppose you found what you were looking for." "I am happy, Henry," Clara said, her voice trembling slightly but clear. "If that is what you mean. Happy?" Henry laughed. It was a sharp, barking sound. "I bet you are. You know, folks were confused when you ran off. They thought you were scared. But I told them, no, Clara is smart. Why settle for a merchant's son when you can trap the man who owns the mortgage? Right?" The accusation hung in the air. The other customers watched, hungry for the drama. "She did not know what I owned," Elias said, his voice low and dangerous. "Watch your mouth. Henry." "Oh, I am sure she didn't," Henry sneered. "Just a lucky coincidence. She walked 10 miles in a blizzard and just happened to stumble onto the richest ranch in the valley. You really are a piece of work. Clara, a real little gold digger. Tell me, is he worth it? Does he pay you well for your services?" The insult was so crude, so vicious, that Clara gasped. Blood rushed to her face. Her hand twitched, her palm itching to strike the smirk off his face. Elias moved. It was a subtle shift of weight, his hands curling into fists at his sides. The muscles in his jaw flexed, a rhythmic pulsing of rage. "That is enough," Elias said. His voice was not loud, but it had a tremor in it that made the clerk behind the counter reach for the shotgun under the shelf. "Step aside, Henry, or I will move you." Henry looked at Elias's fists, then at the size of the man. He saw the violence waiting behind Elias's eyes. He stepped back, holding up his hands in mock surrender. Touchy, Henry said. "Just making conversation. Buy your flour. Ward, I'm sure you can afford it." Elias stared at him for a second longer, then turned to the counter. He gave his order to the terrified clerk in short, clipped sentences. Clara stood beside him, staring at the floor, fighting back tears of humiliation. She felt the eyes of the town burning into her back. They left the store 10 minutes later, Elias carrying the sacks of flour and coffee. They stepped out onto the boardwalk, the fresh air a relief after the stifling atmosphere inside. But they were not done. Silas Kincaid was waiting for them by the hitching post. He was dressed in a black frock coat, looking every inch the respectable businessman, save for the hardness in his eyes. "Mr. Ward," Silas said, tipping his hat. "Mrs. Ward." Elias placed the sacks into the saddlebags. He turned slowly. "Silas, I was hoping we might have a word," Silas said smoothly, "about some outstanding matters regarding your wife." My wife has no outstanding matters, Elias said. On the contrary, Silas said, pulling a folded paper from his pocket. There is the matter of the $300 I paid to Mrs. Gable, a payment made in exchange for a contract of marriage, a contract that was breached. The contract was invalid, Elias said. You cannot buy a person. Silas. The debt is void. I purchased a debt, Silas corrected. And I expected a return on my investment, since the merchandise was defective, or rather, stolen. I expect repayment. She owes you nothing, Elias said, stepping closer to Silas. He towered over the older man. Any paper you have is meaningless. If you want your money, go ask Mrs. Gable for a refund. Silas didn't flinch. His eyes narrowed. I'm afraid it is not that simple. You see, Elias, in this territory, a wife's debts become her husband's. If you claim her obligations. $300, plus interest, plus damages for the humiliation of my son. I will not pay you a dime. Elias spat. Then we will let the judge decide, Silas said softly. Judge Holloway is a stickler for property rights. I imagine he will find it very interesting that you are harboring a woman who defrauded a prominent citizen. He might even look into your other holdings. See if everything is in order. It was a threat, clear and simple. Silas was going to use the law to tear Elias's world apart. Stay away from my ranch, Elias said, and stay away from my wife. For now, Silas said, stepping back. Safe travels, Mr. Ward. The ride back to the ranch was silent. The sun had dipped behind the mountains, casting long, purple shadows across the snow. Clara rode with her head down, the tears finally falling now that the town was behind them. I am sorry, she whispered when they reached the yard. I am so sorry. Elias. Stop, Elias said. He lifted her down from the horse, his hands gripping her waist tightly. You have nothing to apologize for. They are thieves. They are trying to scare us. But the scare tactics escalated quickly. 2 days later, a man rode out to the ranch. He wore a tin star pinned to his coat. It was Deputy Miller, the sheriff's cousin, a man known for his laziness and his loyalty to whoever bought his whiskey. He didn't get off his horse. He sat by the gate, looking over the cattle in the pen. Just inspecting, Miller shouted when Elias came out of the barn with a rifle. Received a complaint about stolen livestock. Just checking brands. These cattle are branded with the circle W, Elias shouted back. You know that. Miller. Just doing my job. Miller smirked. Judge wants a full inventory. Says there might be a lien coming on this property. Best keep your papers in order. Ward. He rode off, but the message was received. The legal machinery was turning. Elias spent the nights pacing. He sat with his ledgers, calculating. He had money, but if Silas tied his assets up in court, if the judge froze his accounts, he could lose the leverage he had. He could lose the ranch. Clara felt the tension radiating off him. She felt the noose tightening, and she knew she was the knot. Then came the fire. It was a week after the trip to town. The night was moonless, pitch black and freezing. The wind had picked up, blowing hard from the north. Clara woke to the sound of the dogs barking. Not the playful bark of greeting, but the frantic, snarling bark of alarm. Then she smelled it, the acrid, biting scent of wood smoke. Elias, she screamed, shaking him awake. Elias was up instantly. He smelled the smoke and saw the orange flicker dancing against the bedroom curtains, light coming from outside. The barn, he roared, grabbing his trousers and boots. They rushed out of the cabin into the night. It wasn't the main barn. It was the outbuilding, the sturdy wooden shed where they stored the winter feed, the tools, and where Clara had stored the small trunk containing the few things she had brought from her old life. Flames were licking up the side of the structure, whipped by the wind into a frenzy. Sparks swirled up into the star-littered sky like angry fireflies. The buckets, Elias yelled. Get the buckets. He ran to the horse trough, breaking the layer of ice with his fist. He plunged a bucket in, hauling it out, and ran toward the fire. Clara followed, her breath tearing in her throat. They fought the fire for an hour. It was a brutal, desperate battle. The water froze on their clothes. The smoke burned their eyes and lungs. They weren't trying to save the shed. It was too far gone. But they had to stop the sparks from jumping to the main barn or the house. Elias worked like a machine, throwing water, beating at the dry grass with a wet blanket. Clara hauled water until her arms felt like they were being torn from their sockets. Finally, the roof of the shed collapsed with a crash, sending a geyser of sparks into the air. The fire settled down to a sullen, glowing heap. It was over. The barn was safe. The house was safe. But the shed was gone. Clara stood in the snow, her face streaked with soot and sweat, her chest heaving. She stared at the blackened, smoking ruins. Her trunk was in there, the ribbon her father had given her before he left, the worn Bible with her mother's name written in the front cover. The only proofs that she had existed before she was a debt, they were ash. Her legs gave out. She sank down into the snow, covering her face with her hands. A sob tore through her, raw and jagged. "It is gone," she wailed. "Everything is gone." Elias dropped his bucket. He walked over to her and fell to his knees in the mud and snow. He pulled her into his arms. "Clara," he rasped, his voice wrecked from the smoke. "I am cursed," she sobbed into his wet shirt. "I am cursed. Elias, everywhere I go burns. First the church, now this. I bring fire. I bring ruin." "No," Elias said fierce and low, holding her tight against him. "No." "I do," she cried. "Look at it. They did this because of me. They will burn the house next. They will kill you." "They will not kill me," Elias swore, pressing his face into her singed, smoky hair. "And you are not cursed. You are not cursed. Clara, this is not magic. This is men, wicked, small men." "I lost it," she whispered, her voice breaking. "My mother's book. It was all I had." Elias held her while she wept, rocking her back and forth in the dying glow of the firelight. He looked over her head at the charred remains of the shed. His eyes were dry, but they were burning with a cold, terrifying light. He knew who had done this. He knew it in his bones. This was a message. "We can touch you. We can burn you out." "I will build it back," Elias whispered to her. "I will get you a new Bible. I will get you ribbons of silk, but I will not let you say you are cursed." He lifted her up, carrying her back toward the cabin. But the damage was done. In the days that followed, Clara retreated. The resilience she had shown during the storm, during the early days of their marriage, seemed to evaporate. She moved through the cabin like a ghost. She stopped humming. She stopped sewing. She flinched when the wood settled in the stove. She woke up screaming in the night, dreaming of flames. She withdrew from Elias, not out of lack of love, but out of shame. She believed, deep in her damaged heart, that she was the poison in his life. She saw the worry lines deepening on his face, the way he watched the horizon with a rifle near his hand, and she knew it was her fault. Elias tried to reach her. He brought her the first crocus of spring, pushing up through the snow. He tried to talk to her about the cattle, about the future. "Clara," he would say, sitting by the bed where she lay staring at the wall. "Talk to me." "I am tired," she would whisper. "Just tired." He felt helpless. He could fight a blizzard. He could fight a fire. He could fight Silas Kincaid. But he didn't know how to fight the silence that was reclaiming his wife. He was terrified that he was failing her, just as he had failed Sarah. The fear made him clumsy. He stopped trying to force her to talk and instead retreated into his own silence, patrolling the perimeter of the ranch, waiting for the next blow to fall. The winter was ending, but the real storm was just about to break. March arrived like a bruised fighter, the wind raw and aggressive, kicking up the drying mud of Main Street and plastering it against the storefronts. In Red Hollow, the mood was just as ugly. Silas Kincaid had wasted no time. He had used the printing press in the back of the land office to churn out handbills on cheap yellow paper. They were plastered on the hitching posts, on the side of the livery stable, and prominently in the window of the bank. "Notice to the public. Investigation pending. Regarding the fraudulent mortgage practices of Elias Ward, citizens are advised to suspend payments. It was a masterstroke of manipulation. Silas knew that nothing rallied a desperate man faster than the promise of a villain to blame for his empty pockets. He painted Elias not just as a recluse, but as a predator, a shadow banker who had been secretly squeezing the life out of the town while pretending to be a simple rancher. The town, weary from a winter that had stretched their supplies and their patience to the breaking point, was ripe for the infection. In the saloons, men who owed money to the bank, debts that Elias had quietly purchased and kept from foreclosure, drank Silas's whiskey and nodded along to his lies. "He sits up there on that ridge," a miner growled, slamming his glass down, "counting our money while we freeze, and now he has bought himself a bride with it." Clara felt the weight of it every time she rode into town. She had to come. The legal threats Silas had leveled required responses, and Elias could not leave the ranch unguarded for long. So Clara became the courier, riding the 10 miles to deliver letters to the post office for the lawyer in Cheyenne. On a Tuesday afternoon, under a sky the color of a slate roof, Clara tied her mare outside the post office. She kept her head down, the brim of her bonnet pulled low, but she could not block out the sound. As she stepped onto the boardwalk, 2 women standing by the dry goods store fell silent. They watched her with eyes hard as flint. "That is her," one whispered, loud enough to be heard across the street. "The one who sold herself, walks proud for a whore," the other replied. Clara's step faltered, but she forced herself to keep moving. She clutched the letters to her chest, her knuckles white. She told herself they were just words. Words could not bleed her. She reached the door of the post office, but before she could enter, a man stepped out of the alleyway. He was a drifter, drunk at midday, holding a half-eaten apple that was brown with rot. "Hey, Mrs. Ward," he slurred. "You look hungry. You look like you would take anything offered." He threw the apple. It struck the boardwalk inches from Clara's boot, splattering brown pulp across the hem of her dress. Laughter erupted from the porch of the saloon across the street. Clara froze. The humiliation was a physical blow. A stone dropped into her stomach. She felt the heat rising in her neck, the sting of tears in her eyes. She wanted to run. Every instinct she had honed over years of poverty screamed at her to flee, to hide, to vanish. But then she thought of Elias. She thought of him walking the perimeter of the ranch night after night, his rifle in his arm, protecting a home that the town wanted to burn. He had not run. Clara slowly raised her head. She looked at the drunk, then swept her gaze across the street to the men laughing on the porch. She did not speak. She simply looked at them with a cold, devastating dignity. The laughter died away, choked off by her refusal to break. She stepped around the mess on the wood and entered the post office. It was later, as she was preparing to leave, that the real danger revealed itself. She had gone around the back of the livery stable to tighten the cinch on her saddle, seeking a moment of privacy before facing the gauntlet of the street again. The smell of wet hay and horse manure was thick in the alley. Voices drifted from the open back door of the stable, low, urgent. "Tonight," a man said. Clara recognized the voice. It was one of the hired guns Silas had brought in from Laramie, a man with a snake tattoo on his neck. "Silas wants it done tonight. No more waiting on the lawyers." "The wind is right," another voice answered. "It is blowing hard from the north. If we light the big barn, the sparks will take the house in 10 minutes. Clara's hands froze on the leather strap. Her heart stopped, then hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "And Ward?" the second man asked. "If he comes out, he burns," the first man said. "Or he catches a bullet. Accidents happen in a fire." "Sheriff Miller will call it a tragedy and sign the paper." "What about the girl?" "Silas says she comes back to town, if she gets singed a little." "Well, maybe that will teach her a lesson." Clara backed away, her boots silent in the mud. The blood had drained from her face. This was not legal maneuvering. This was murder. They were going to burn Elias alive. She scrambled into the saddle, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped the reins. She didn't bother with the main street. She cut through the alley, spurring the mare into a gallop before she even hit the edge of town. The wind whipped her face, stinging her eyes, but she didn't feel it. She rode with a singular, terrifying purpose. She had spent her life running away from danger, running from the debts, running from the church, running from the cold. Now, she was riding straight into the fire. Faster! She urged the horse, leaning over the animal's neck. Faster! Dusk was falling by the time she reached the ranch. The sun was a blood-red smear on the horizon, and the shadows were stretching long and purple across the snow-crusted fields. Elias was by the corral, forking hay to the cattle. He looked up at the sound of hooves thundering into the yard. He dropped the pitchfork, his hand going to the colt on his hip, but relaxed when he recognized the mare. Then he saw Clara's face. She slid from the saddle before the horse had fully stopped, stumbling in the mud. Elias caught her. "Clara, what happened?" He gripped her shoulders, his eyes scanning her for injury. "Did they touch you?" "They are coming," she gasped, fighting for breath. "Tonight, I heard them at the livery. Silas's men, they are going to burn the barn. They said if you come out, accidents happen." Elias went very still. The worry on his face vanished, replaced by a terrifying calm. It was the face of the man who had survived blizzards and solitary years. It was the face of a man who was done retreating. "Burn the barn," he repeated softly. "We have to leave," Clara pleaded, grabbing his coat. "Elias, we have to go. There are too many of them." "No," Elias said. "They will kill you." "No," he said again, deeper this time. He looked over her head at the house, at the smoke curling from the chimney, at the curtains she had sewn in the window. "I am done hiding, Clara. I am done letting them think they can take what is mine." He released her and turned to the bunkhouse where his one hired hand, an old, tough-as-leather cowboy named Jeb, was mending a bridle. "Jeb!" Elias roared. The old man stuck his head out. "Boss?" "Saddle the roan," Elias ordered. "Ride to the Miller homestead. Ride to the Swenson place. Ride to O'Malley's." Jeb stepped out, sensing the shift in the air. "What am I telling them?" "Tell them the note holder is calling in a favor," Elias said, his voice hard as iron. "Tell them Silas Kincaid is coming to burn me out tonight." Tell them if they ever wanted to stand up to the man who has had his boot on their necks for 10 years. Tonight is the night. Jeb's eyes widened. He looked at Elias, then at Clara, then nodded slowly. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the snow. "I reckon O'Malley has been waiting 5 years for a chance to take a shot at a Kincaid." "Go," Elias said. "Tell them to come armed, and tell them to come quiet." Jeb ran for the barn. Elias turned back to Clara. "Can you shoot?" Clara looked at him. She was trembling, but the panic was receding, replaced by a cold, hard resolve she hadn't known she possessed. She thought of the apple hitting the boardwalk. She thought of Henry's smirk. She thought of the charred ruins of her mother's Bible. "Yes," she said. "Good," Elias said. "Go inside. Load the rifles, all of them, and put out the lamps." Night fell like a hammer. The sky was a vast, glittering dome of stars, beautiful and indifferent. The cold was intense, freezing the mud of the yard into ruts of iron. The ranch was silent. The house was dark. To anyone watching, it looked like the occupants were asleep, unaware of the doom approaching from the road. But inside the barn, and behind the woodpile near the house, men were waiting. Jeb had returned, and he had not come alone. 4 men from the valley had ridden back with him, hard-faced men who worked the land and hated the Kincaids with a quiet, festering intensity. They lay in the hayloft and behind the water trough, their breath steaming in the dark, rifles resting on their knees. Elias and Clara were positioned behind the stack of split logs on the porch. Elias had his Winchester. Clara held a lighter shotgun, a double-barreled weapon that kicked like a mule but didn't require precision aim. "Stay down," Elias whispered, his shoulder pressing against hers. "Do not fire until I do." "I'm not afraid," Clara whispered back. And she realized, with a jolt, that it was true. She was terrified of losing him. But she was not afraid of the fight. "Quiet," Elias hissed. "Listen." At first, there was only the wind. Then, the sound of hoofbeats, muffled, slow. Shapes materialized out of the darkness at the end of the lane. 6 riders, maybe 7. They moved with the arrogance of men who expected no resistance. They stopped at the edge of the yard. "Light them up," a voice called out. It was the man from the livery. A match flared, then another. Torches, soaked in kerosene, burst into jagged orange flame, illuminating the riders' faces. They wore masks of bandana, but the horses were recognizable. And in the center, unmasked and sitting tall on a black stallion, was Silas Kincaid. Beside him was Henry. "Take the barn first," Silas commanded. "Flush the rats out." A rider spurred his horse forward, swinging the torch in a wide arc, preparing to throw it into the open door of the main hay barn. Crack! The sound of Elias's rifle was deafening in the silence. The torch exploded in the rider's hand, shattered by the bullet. The man screamed, dropping the burning brand into the snow, where it hissed and died. His horse reared, throwing him into the dirt. "Go home, Silas!" Elias's voice rang out from the darkness of the porch. It was not a shout. It was a command that cut through the cold air like a whip. "Get off my land!" For a second, the riders froze. They had expected a sleeping victim, not a marksman. "He is there!" Henry shouted, pointing his pistol at the porch. "Kill him!" Chaos erupted. The riders opened fire, the muzzle flashes lighting up the yard like strobe lights. Bullets chewed into the wood of the porch, sending splinters flying. Elias fired back, working the lever of his Winchester with a mechanical rhythm. "Now!" Elias yelled. From the hayloft and the water trough, the homesteaders opened fire. The ambush was total. The Kincaid men were caught in a crossfire. Horses screamed and bolted. Men shouted in confusion, wheeling their mounts, trying to find a target in the dark. Clara rested the shotgun on the log. She saw a rider trying to circle around the side of the house, heading for the back door. She didn't think. She pulled the trigger. The shotgun roared, slamming into her shoulder. The buckshot tore through the air, striking the ground in front of the horse. The animal shied violently, throwing the rider. "Reload!" Elias shouted, firing again. Clara broke the breech, her fingers fumbling with the shells. She shoved 2 more in, snapped it shut. "Henry's flanking," Elias warned. Clara looked to the left. Henry Kincaid had dismounted and was creeping along the fence line, using the posts for cover. He had a rifle, and he was raising it, aiming at Elias's exposed profile as Elias tracked a rider in the yard. Clara didn't have a clear shot at Henry's body, but she had a line on his position. She swung the shotgun. She didn't fire. She stood up. "Henry!" she screamed. Henry jerked his head around. He saw her. She stood on the edge of the porch, illuminated by the flash of gunfire. The shotgun leveled straight at his chest. The poor bride, the property he had bought. He looked into her eyes. There was no fear there. There was only a promise. He hesitated. In that second of hesitation, the tide turned. "Drop it!" a voice roared from the yard. O'Malley, the farmer, had stepped out from the barn, flanked by the Swede. They had the Kincaid hired guns surrounded. 2 of the hired men were down in the snow, clutching leg wounds. The others were throwing up their hands, realizing the paycheck wasn't worth dying for. The shooting stopped as quickly as it had begun. The silence that rushed back in was ringing and heavy, punctuated only by the groans of the injured men and the heavy breathing of the horses. Silas Kincaid sat on his horse in the middle of the yard. He was untouched, but his face was a mask of fury. He looked at his hired men surrendering. He looked at the homesteaders, men he had bullied for years, standing with rifles pointed at him. Elias stepped off the porch. He walked into the light of the remaining torches that had fallen in the snow. He held his rifle low, but ready. "It is over. Silas," Elias said. Silas looked down at him. "This is not over. You fired on citizens. You incited a riot. I will have the law on you before the sun comes up." "The law is already here," a voice called out. Sheriff Miller rode into the yard, followed by 2 deputies. He had arrived late, as usual, waiting until the shooting stopped. But he saw the scene clearly enough. He saw Silas's men with torches. He saw the ambush. "I see a lot of torches. Mr. Kincaid," the sheriff said, his voice neutral. He looked at Elias, then at the homesteaders. He counted the rifles. He did the math. The power had shifted. "You have no authority here," Silas snapped. "This man is a fraud. He holds illegal debts." "They are not illegal," Elias said, walking closer to Silas's horse. He stopped 10 feet away. "And they are not just debts." Elias looked around the yard, making sure every man heard him. "I own the note on the mercantile." "Silas," Elias said loudly. "I bought it 3 years ago when you expanded the warehouse. I own the note on your house, and I own the note on the bank itself." Silas went pale. "You lie. Check your ledgers," Elias said. "The holding company in Denver? That is me. I could have foreclosed on you 6 months ago when you missed a payment. I didn't. I waited." He looked at Henry, who was standing by the fence, his rifle lowered, looking small and defeated. "I thought I could be decent," Elias said. "But you are right. Silas, tonight we settle accounts." Silas's hand twitched toward his coat. He was a man who had never lost. He couldn't conceive of a world where he didn't hold the cards. His arrogance was a blinder. "You will not take what is mine," Silas hissed. He drew. It was a fast move, born of desperation and rage. He pulled a small revolver from his coat pocket, but Elias had been waiting for it. Elias didn't even raise his rifle. He fired from the hip, a skill learned in a harder life than Silas had ever known. Bang! The shot hit Silas in the shoulder, spinning him around in the saddle. He cried out, the pistol flying from his hand into the darkness. He slumped forward, clutching his shoulder, blood seeping through his fine black coat. "Don't!" Henry screamed, dropping his rifle and running toward his father. "Hold fire!" the sheriff yelled, spurring his horse between Elias and the Kincaids. Elias stood there, smoke curling from the barrel of his Winchester. He didn't move. He watched Henry pull Silas from the horse. The great man of Red Hollow was groaning in the mud, reduced to a wounded animal. "Self-defense," the sheriff said, looking at his deputies. We all saw it. Kincaid drew first. The deputies nodded. They, too, knew which way the wind was blowing. "Get him to the doctor," Elias said, his voice flat. "And get off my land." Henry looked up at Elias. There was hate in his eyes, but there was also fear. He looked at Clara, who was still standing on the porch, the shotgun in her hands. He looked at the homesteaders who stood shoulder to shoulder with Elias. Henry said nothing. He helped his men lift Silas onto a horse. The retreat was slow and ragged. The hired guns limped away. The Kincaid dynasty, broken and bleeding, faded back into the dark. Elias watched them go. When the last hoofbeat faded, he let the rifle drop to his side. He felt a sudden, crushing exhaustion. He turned to the homesteaders. "Thank you," he said. "All of you. Your debts. We will talk about them. Things will change." O'Malley nodded, spitting on the ground. "You stood up. Elias, that is enough for tonight." The men mounted up and rode out, leaving the ranch to the silence. Elias turned to the porch. Clara had set the shotgun down. She was leaning against the post, shaking. He walked to her. He didn't say a word. He wrapped his arms around her, burying his face in her neck. She clung to him, her fingers digging into his coat. They stood there as the adrenaline faded and the cold seeped back in. They were alive. The barn was still standing. "You didn't run," Elias whispered. "Neither did you," Clara replied. The dawn began to bleed gray over the eastern hills, revealing the trampled snow, the bloodstains in the yard, and the scarred, scorched wood of the porch. It was a bleak morning, but as the sun crested the ridge, the light hit the windows of the cabin, the windows where Clara hung her yellow curtains, and the glass blazed with sudden, brilliant gold. The thaw did not come all at once. It came in fits and starts, much like the change in Red Hollow itself. In the weeks following the shooting in the ranch yard, the snow receded into dirty, weeping patches in the hollows. The mud took over, thick and clinging, making the road to town a trial for any wagon. But the news traveled regardless. It moved faster than the spring melt, jumping from fence line to fence line. Carried by ranch hands and circuit preachers, Silas Kincaid was gone. The bullet Elias Ward had put in his shoulder had not killed him, but it had shattered something far more vital than bone. It had shattered his aura of invincibility. He had been hauled away in a carriage bound for a hospital in Denver, Henry riding silently beside him, leaving behind a power vacuum that made the air in town feel thin and strange. For the first time in 20 years, the Kincaid shadow was lifted, but in its place, there was a nervous uncertainty. The townspeople knew that Elias Ward was the new power. The rumors that had once painted him as a miserly villain now morphed into something mythical. He was the man who had outdrawn Silas. He was the man who owned the banknotes. He was the man who had stood on his porch with a rifle and a runaway bride and told the devil to get off his land. Some were grateful, specifically the men who had stood with him that night, but others were afraid. They owed money. They owed it to the Kincaids, or so they had thought, and now they found they owed it to the quiet man on the ridge. They waited for the other boot to drop. They waited for Elias to ride in with the sheriff and start evicting them, just as Silas would have done. Elias felt this tension. He felt it when he rode into town to buy nails and the conversation on the boardwalk died instantly. He saw the way men touched the brims of their hats, not in friendship, but in deference. "They are afraid of you," Clara said one evening. She was sweeping the floor of the cabin, the rhythmic swish-swish of the broom filling the silence. "They think you traded one tyrant for another." Elias sat at the table, the black ledger open in front of him. He looked tired. The victory had not brought him peace. It had brought him a responsibility he wasn't sure he knew how to carry. "I never wanted this," Elias muttered. "I wanted to be left alone." "You cannot be alone," Clara said, stopping her sweeping. She walked over to him and placed a hand on his shoulder. Her touch was firm, grounding. "Not anymore. You own their roofs, Elias. You have to tell them what that means. If you stay silent, their fear will turn to hate." Elias looked up at her. He saw the wisdom in her eyes that had seen the worst of men and still managed to look at him with love. She was right. He could not hide in the silence anymore. "Sunday," Elias said, closing the book. "I will talk to them on Sunday." The meeting was held in the church hall, a drafty wooden building that smelled of damp wool and old hymnals. It was packed. Every man who held a mortgage, every shopkeeper who had been squeezed by Kincaid's rates, was there. When Elias walked in, Clara at his side, the room went dead quiet. Clara wore her gray dress, the one she had been married in, but she had sewn a collar of blue lace onto it. She held her head high, though she felt the weight of 50 pairs of eyes on her. She saw Mrs. Gable in the back row, looking shrunken and sour. She saw the women who had whispered about her at the pump. Elias walked to the front of the room. He did not go to the pulpit. He stood in front of the altar table. He carried the black ledger. He placed it on the table. The sound of the heavy leather cover hitting the wood echoed like a gavel strike. Elias looked at the crowd. He was not a speechmaker. He was a man of few words, and his hands were sweating. But then he looked at Clara, sitting in the front pew. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. "I am not Silas Kincaid," Elias began. His voice was low, but it carried to the back of the room. "And I am not a banker." He rested his hand on the ledger. "For 10 years, I have bought your debts," he said. "I bought them because I had the money, and I hated seeing good people thrown off their land because of a bad harvest or a hard winter. I kept it secret because I did not want your gratitude. I just wanted your solvency." A murmur ran through the room. "But secrecy breeds poison," Elias continued. "You thought I was hoarding land. You thought I was waiting to crush you." He opened the book. "I am not going to crush you, but I am not going to give you charity either. A man needs to pay his way to keep his dignity." He looked at O'Malley, the farmer who had fought beside him. "I am cutting the interest rates to 2%, Elias said, "for everyone. And I'm extending the terms by 5 years. If you have a bad year, you do not pay. You add it to the end of the term. No penalties. No foreclosure unless you abandon the land." The room was silent, stunned. 2% was unheard of. It was practically free money compared to the 12% Silas had charged. "But there is a condition," Elias said. His voice hardened slightly. "We are done with the fear. We are done with the backroom deals and the threats. If you owe me, you deal with me, man to man. If you have a problem, you ride out to the ranch and tell me. We build this town back on trust, or I burn this book and leave you to the sharks from Cheyenne." He stopped. He looked around the room. "That is all I have to say." For a long moment, no one moved. Then, the widow Miller, a woman whose face was etched with the lines of 50 hard winters, stood up. She walked to the front of the room. She stopped in front of Elias, her hands trembling. 2%? She asked, her voice cracking. 2%. "Martha," Elias said gently. She began to cry. She didn't sob. She just let the tears fall, the relief breaking a dam that had held for a decade. She reached out and took Elias's hand, shaking it with a desperate grip. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you, Mr. Ward." That broke the spell. Men began to stand up. Some were smiling, slapping each other on the back. Others were still wary, looking for the trap, but finding none in Elias's steady gaze. As the meeting broke up, people drifted toward the door. A few stopped near Clara. One of them was the woman who had called her a whore outside the dry goods store. She stopped, twisting her bonnet strings, refusing to meet Clara's eye. "Mrs. Ward," the woman mumbled. "Mrs. Higgins," Clara said evenly. I reckon we were wrong," the woman said, looking at her boots. "About the fire, and about other things. It is a good thing you did, standing by him." "He is a good man," Clara said. "He is worth standing by." "Yes," the woman said. She looked up, her face flushed. "I reckon he is. It wasn't a full apology. It wasn't warm friendship, but it was a start. It was the first green shoot pushing up through the frost." Clara watched Elias surrounded by men shaking his hand. She felt a complicated swell of emotion in her chest. She saw the power he held. He effectively owned the town now. That power terrified her. She knew how easily it could corrupt. She remembered Silas. She remembered Mrs. Gable. But then she watched Elias pull his hand away from a man who was trying to kiss his ring, looking embarrassed and uncomfortable. She saw him turn to look for her, his eyes seeking her out across the crowd, needing her anchor. He was not them. He chose, every day, to be different. Spring broke the back of winter in April. The snow vanished in a rush of roaring creeks and mud that turned the valley into a brown sea. But then came the green. It exploded from the earth, vibrant and hungry. At the ranch, the work was endless. There were calves to brand, fences to mend, and a garden to plant. Clara threw herself into the rebuilding of the shed. She didn't want just a storage shack this time. She had a different idea. "A bunkhouse," she told Elias as they stood over the charred foundation. "With a stove and 2 beds. "We have a bunkhouse," Elias said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Jeb sleeps in it." "Not for hands," Clara said. "For people. For families passing through who have nowhere to go. For women who run away." Elias looked at her. He saw the shadow of her own history in her eyes. She wanted to build the sanctuary she had never found. "It will cost money," Elias said, testing her. "And we will have to feed them." "We can afford it," Clara said firmly. "We have the interest payments coming in from the town. We can give some of it back." Elias smiled. It was a slow, rare expression that made him look 10 years younger. "You are spending my money, Mrs. Ward." "Our money," Clara corrected, picking up a hammer. "And you are going to help me frame the wall." They worked side by side. It was hard labor. Clara's hands grew calloused, her skin browned by the sun. They argued. Of course. Elias was practical, worried about being taken advantage of. Clara was generous to a fault, wanting to save everyone. We cannot feed the whole territory. Clara, Elias would growl when she drew up plans for a larger pantry. We can feed one family, she would retort, holding a nail between her teeth. And that is enough. But the arguments were devoid of malice. They were the friction of two lives fitting together, grinding down the sharp edges until they sat flush. Their nights were the reward. The fear that had defined their early union, the fear of discovery, of violence, of abandonment, was gone. In its place was a deep, abiding security. They lay in the dark, the window open to the sounds of the spring peepers in the creek. "Do you think about leaving?" Elias asked one night, his arm heavy across her waist. "Leaving?" Clara turned to look at him in the moonlight. "Where would I go?" "Anywhere," Elias said. "You are free. Clara, you know that." "I know," she whispered. She traced the line of his jaw with her finger. "That is why I stay, because I am free to go, and there is nowhere on this earth I would rather be." She kissed him then, a slow, deep kiss that tasted of contentment. They made love with a slow, deliberate passion, no longer frantic to prove their existence, but savoring the simple miracle of being known. Summer burned into autumn, turning the aspens to gold on the ridges. And then the wind turned from the north again. The frost returned. The snow began to dust the peaks. It was coming up on a year. The town of Red Hollow decided to hold a Christmas gathering. In years past, under the Kincaids, these parties had been stiff, obligatory affairs where people drank watered-down punch and tried to avoid Silas's gaze. This year, the committee, led by the widow Miller, sent an invitation to the ranch. "They want us to come," Clara said, reading the letter by the fire. "They want me to help decorate the church?" Elias looked up from his book. "Do you want to go?" Clara hesitated. The memories of that church were still sharp, the smell of the incense, the trap closing around her. But she thought of the bunkhouse they had built. She thought of the way Mrs. Higgins had nodded to her on the street last week. "Yes," Clara said. "I think I do." The day before Christmas, Clara rode into town. The hostility that had once choked the air was gone, replaced by a respectful curiosity. Inside the church, women were hanging garlands of pine and holly. When Clara walked in, the conversation didn't stop. "Clara, Mrs." Miller called out. "Over here, we need someone tall to reach the top of the window." Clara worked alongside them. She smelled the pine sap on her hands. It was the same smell as the day of the wedding, but the context had changed entirely. She was not a victim. She was a neighbor. Children ran through the aisles, chasing each other. A little girl with blonde braids stopped in front of Clara and stared up at her with wide eyes. "Are you the bride?" the girl asked. Clara smiled, crouching down. "I am." "Billy says you shot the rich man's son," the girl whispered, awed, "with a cannon." Clara laughed, a sound that surprised even her. "It was a shotgun, and I didn't shoot him. I just made sure he listened." The girl nodded solemnly, as if this were even more impressive. The gathering that night was simple. There was no orchestra, just a man with a fiddle and another with a harmonica. There was no champagne, just hot cider and coffee. Elias stood near the back, uncomfortable in his suit, but men kept coming up to him, not to ask for loans, but to talk about the weather, about the price of beef, about the winter ahead. They included him in the tribe of men who struggled against the land. He was no longer the vulture on the ridge. He was just Elias. Clara moved through the crowd, accepting small gifts. A jar of spiced peaches from Mrs. Higgins, a knitted scarf from the baker's wife. These were peace offerings. They were admissions of guilt and promises of a fresh start. Later, as the fiddle played a slow, sweet waltz, Elias found her. "Mrs. Ward," he said, bowing slightly. "May I?" Clara took his hand. "You do not dance." "Elias, for you," he said. "I will try." They moved to the center of the floor. Elias was stiff, counting the steps under his breath, but he held her as if she were the only solid thing in the world. Clara rested her head against his chest, closing her eyes. She felt the eyes of the town on them. But she didn't care. Let them look. Let them see what love looked like when it had walked through fire to find itself. The ride home was cold, the air biting with the familiar teeth of a Wyoming winter. But they were wrapped in buffalo robes, their knees touching as the horses plodded through the snow. The sky was a dome of black velvet scattered with diamond dust. The moon cast long blue shadows across the plains. They crested the rise and saw the ranch. It was dark, except for the glow of the embers they had left in the stove, painting the windows with a faint, welcoming orange. The new bunkhouse stood sturdy and waiting. The barn loomed large and safe. "It looks different," Clara said softly. "How?" Elias asked. "It looks like a home," she said. "Not a fortress." They stabled the horses, the animals huffing warm breath into the cold air. Elias barred the door, a habit he would never break, but his movements were easy. Inside the cabin, the warmth hit them. It smelled of the pine boughs Clara had placed on the mantel and the cinnamon of the cider they had heated earlier. Elias lit the lamp. The light washed over the room. It illuminated the yellow curtains, the rug by the fire, the books on the shelf, and the new Bible Clara had bought. Sitting on the table with a silk ribbon marking the page, they shed their heavy coats. Elias added a log to the fire, poking it until the flames leaped up, crackling and bright. He sat in his chair. Clara sat on the rug at his feet, leaning back against his legs. He rested his hand on her head, his fingers absently stroking her hair. Outside, the wind picked up. It was the same sound as last year, the low, mournful howl of the plains. "It is snowing," Elias said, looking at the window where flakes were beginning to stick to the glass. Clara watched the fire. "1 year," she whispered. "Does it feel longer?" Elias asked. "It feels like a lifetime," she said. She turned to look up at him. "Last Christmas Eve, when I was walking down that road, I thought I was walking to my death. I thought the cold would take me, or Henry would find me. I didn't think I would see the morning." Elias looked down at her. His face was shadowed, but his eyes were clear. "I sat in this chair," he said softly, "listening to the wind. I thought I wanted the silence. I thought if I just kept the door locked, the world couldn't hurt me again. And then I knocked," Clara said. "And then you knocked," Elias repeated. A small smile touched his lips. "I thought I was letting in trouble." Clara turned fully, resting her arms on his knees. "And what did you let in?" Elias reached down, cupping her face in his rough hands. He ran his thumb over her cheekbone, looking at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I let in the only thing that ever made this land feel like home," he said. "I let in my life." Clara's eyes filled with tears, but they did not fall. She rose to her knees, reaching up to him. Elias leaned down. The kiss was not frantic. It was not the desperate collision of two people trying to survive. It was slow. It was deep. It tasted of the cold air and the warm fire. It carried the memory of the blizzard, the slide on the ice, the smell of the burning barn, and the sound of the gunshot that had broken the Kincaid hold. It was a kiss of ownership, not of one person owning another, but of two people owning their shared fate. They broke apart, but didn't move away. They stayed there in the glow of the firelight, the poor bride and the quiet rancher, while the snow fell softly on the roof, sealing them in. They were no longer hiding. They were no longer alone. They were the masters of their own story, ready to face whatever the winter brought, together. Thank you for listening to Poor Bride Walked Into His Ranch on Christmas Eve, not knowing the quiet rancher owned half the town. I hope you enjoyed this journey through the American West with Clara and Elias. It is a story about resilience, justice, and the kind of love that grows in the hardest of places. I would love to know where you are listening from today. Please leave a comment below sharing your location and your thoughts on the story. Did Elias do the right thing by hiding his power for so long? Would you have forgiven the town as Clara did? If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to From Wild West for more tales of romance, survival, and adventure on the frontier. Your support helps us bring these stories to life. Thank you, and until the next trail.